Okay, great. Testing audio. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Sorry, I was trying to get some things sorted out.
Awesome.
Is
You
that
can hear me
working?
though? Yeah, can you hear
Yeah,
me? Okay,
yeah, I can hear
perfect.
you. Okay, good.
Awesome.
Um, all right, let me put this down here.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Like we only have two board members on so far, so let's give it another minute or two to see if we can get a quorum. Shashan's joined. Okay. Okay, it looks like so far I've got 6 board members here: Director Averill, Director Jones, Director Liu, Director Kaufman, Director Brockie, and Director Cromer. So, Mr. Chair, we do have a quorum. I'll just announce if the other board members join us. If we want to go ahead on to the first slide. So this was actually at Director Garcia's request that we just list the board members and when their expiration dates are. So I've included this in the package, and we'll do so going forward. Mr. Chair, I'll just turn it over to you to, I guess, review the agenda or approve the agenda, and then to move us on to approval of the minutes.
Thanks, Craig. From the other commissioners, are there any questions or comments on our agenda for today before we proceed? Hearing none. Craig, would you like us to have a formal approval, or should we just go on?
We can just go on.
All right. Our first action item today is the review and approval of our minutes from our last board meeting. Has everyone had a chance to review? Do you have any comments? Hearing none, might there be a motion to approve the minutes?
A motion to approve the minutes.
We get a second?
I'll second.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes.
Very good.
All right, onward, public comments. It sounds like we do have one person that has signed up for our public comment period.
Yeah, Sonia Macy's from the Routt County Commission. This is sort of new to us. We've only had public comments before. And I'm just reminded we operate the CTE board under Robert's Rules of Order, which means we welcome public comments and take the input seriously, but we typically don't sort of engage or have a conversation about comments afterwards. So Sonia, if you're available, you want to unmute your mic. We look forward to your comments. Please keep it to 3 minutes if possible.
Yes, thank you very much for having me today. My name is Sonia Macy's, and I'm a Routt County Commissioner. For those of you who are not familiar with Routt County, we're small, we're rural, we're up in northwestern Colorado, and people ask us where our closest neighbor is. We typically tell them Wyoming, which puts it into perspective. Our population is less than 30,000 people, but we are really fast growing. I think we all recognize that when COVID happened, people discovered that the mountains were a wonderful place to live, and we have seen people flocking here in numbers, which really, of course, has put a significant strain on our transportation infrastructure. So I actually listened to your last meeting in which you were talking quite a bit about allocation of resources through some of the recent legislative efforts, and how to take into consideration rural areas, and was really appreciative that there was a recognition that we don't have the population to compete with some of these larger, more urban areas, But I just wanted to also make you aware that we really don't have very strong and solid transportation infrastructure right now. We are working on it. Couple of our challenges here are Highway 40. Highway 40 becomes the bypass when Glenwood Canyon is closed. And we have had some pretty significant safety challenges with 40, with 6 fatalities last year alone. And our commuting pattern is basically on Highway 40 between Craig and Steamboat Springs, Craig and the South Valley, where most of our workforce resides. So we have between 3,200 and 3,600 folks traveling on that highway. And so obviously there's a lot of pressure on traffic and transportation issues. We are working with our TPR to alleviate some of these problems. But my ask of you today is that as you're considering how to allocate some of the funding that has come forward, to please consider Routt County and rural Colorado. We are working on our own to advance a regional transportation authority. We hope to present that to the voters in November of 2025. And we see that as a potential for matching funds for any kind of investment that the state or federal government could put into our transportation infrastructure. And of course, we are fanatical about Mountain Rail and have been working really hard with our partners at the state to try to advance that, and specifically the portion related to our commuters. We recognize that there's some challenges with the longer line, and we look at that as a long-term opportunity, but in the near term, we're very focused on Mountain Rail and the commuter piece of it. So just wanted to make you aware of us up here in the middle of nowhere, and thank you so much for your time and your consideration of how to allocate this important funding for transit improvements.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. Sorry, Chris, go ahead.
I was going to say, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Really appreciate you and your comments.
I would add that Director Blinn and Director Block would join our call as well. Okay, go on to the next slide there, please, Desiree. So just program administrator update. This will be brief. First of all, we issued a NOFA this fall for the second round of ZEV planning grants, and they were due February 7th, I believe. We received 4 applications, and we're in the process of reviewing them. Our anticipation is that we'll have recommendations for awards that we'll bring to the March CTE board meeting. I'm also happy to announce that the actual planning grant contracts for the first round of ZEV planning grants are now all fully executed, and the agencies that received them, I think, are working towards consulting contracts and getting that work underway. Also, after I finish with 1 or 2 things, I'll have Silpa talk about the status of our getting all of the Round 1 capital grants under contract. But just before I go to that, just status of implementation, just a little bit about what I've been doing the last month as CTE director. I've been making presentations at various meetings and conferences and calls, including the track meeting and the transit monthly call. I've been talking to different transit agencies around the state, mostly just to kind of get some input from them, but also to introduce myself. And then this actually isn't completely accurate. The consultant contract for the public engagement is now approved and underway, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And I think I'm this close to getting our contractor who's going to support the formula development efforts, just in the last stages of contract approval, but I expect that any day now. Going to the next slide. Shilpa, do you want to talk a little bit about just the status of our getting the capital grant contracts underway?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes, Shilpa, we can hear you. You just hit your mute though. There you go.
How about now? Yeah, my headphones are playing a little weird game. Yeah, so we have total 11 projects under capital awards, and we have established all the awards into our COTRAM systems, and we are moving forward with risk assessment and milestones and, of course, budgets. There is one project which we are still in the award stage, where we are working on project details on that piece. And talking about the scope of work, we have already drafted this the template for CTE scope of work, and it is under internal review. And that's it.
I have a quick question. I'm seeing the blue and the orange on here, but no label on the legend. Want to make sure I'm reading this graph correctly.
Oh yeah, that's, I think it didn't quietly, that there are some formatting issue, I think, when I put the graph over there. The blue one is showing the how much work is being completed, and the orange one is the phase we are working on that. As you can see, the project are 100% done. Award process is 100% done, and risk assessment is 81.2. It means that there are one project which is under work, but almost getting ready to complete that milestones.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Shubham. Let's go to the next slide. So just one last thing I wanted to provide my update was to talk about the engagement effort or engagement approach for SB 230. You know, as I presented last month, one of the efforts is we're going to go out and try and do some outreach to the transit agencies and then also to a broader range of stakeholders and the public. But the first focus is really going to be on the transit agencies themselves. So I've got a consultant, Confluence Strategy Group. The consultant's under contract, and we begin working with them, and we're fleshing out our approach. Our thought is that we want to do a series of virtual town halls, perhaps organized regionally. We've been interested in some input from the board, but to try and do them in reasonably manageable groups of 10 or 15 agencies per call, probably hour and a half call. And then the purpose of these will be, you know, sort of really threefold. One is to share information about the plan. I know people have been on these calls, and I've been talking to transit agencies, and I've been on like the Transit Monthly call, but still we want to get more information out about what's going on with the program, what our timeline is for developing, standing up the program, and then what some of the requirements may be from the agencies. As part of that, so we also want to just try and set some expectations about what this process is going to look like, you know, what reporting is going to be required, things like that. And then lastly, we really want to get the input from the transit agencies about, you know, both how they might use the funds. I think that'll help us structure the program, but also hear their concerns about how the project might be developed and stood up. With that, I guess I'd open it up to the board to see, does anyone have any sort of comments or thoughts about this engagement approach that they want to share?
So, Craig, so you said it would be planned to be virtual?
I think so. Particularly given the time of year and the travel distances, we're planning to do them as virtual town halls. We could potentially do one, you know, more, you know, in person, maybe more in the Front Range if that would be desired. Do you have particular thoughts about it, Director Putnam?
Kathleen, I see your hand.
Oh, great. Thank you. And I appreciate the overview of this. I was curious, and I actually really like the idea of virtual so that more people can participate from more places. I was curious, how can we as board members participate in the process so we can listen in and hear what the feedback is from the community members?
Great question. I guess first of all, you know, in terms of schedule, we're trying to actually start doing the town halls towards the end of March. You know, and so it's really trying to start the third week of March and maybe do it for 2 or 3, you know, two or three a week for 2 or 3 weeks. And so you know, I would really encourage if board members want to participate, you know, please go ahead and join. If we have multiple board members, we'll just make sure that we announce that so we don't get into any sunshine law issues. Secondly, if any board members would like to, you know, get involved in the actual development of the, you know, engagement approach and our structuring the workshop, you know, I'm happy to have you, you know, involve you as much or as little as you'd like. And I guess third is I plan, at least in the March and April board members, I'll be reporting out what we're hearing from the stakeholders and the transit agencies and folks, so you know what's happening.
Okay, great. Thank you. That sounds great. And I'd be glad to help in any way that would be helpful.
Okay. I'll engage you as we said, we start working with the consultant. If nothing else, perhaps you can, maybe you want to weigh in a little bit on our sort of agenda and approach.
Okay.
Okay, I think that concludes my comments. I think Director Jones, I think this one's you.
Thanks, Craig. So at our last meeting, there were some questions that were kind of off agenda that folks wanted to discuss, and we decided at the last meeting that we'd make sure that there was time at every meeting for directors to have an opportunity to bring up topics that they're feeling are pertinent, or maybe for a future agenda, to make sure that our staff support is able to process. So if there are any comments from directors at this time or questions, now is your time. If you don't mind raising your hand. And if there are none, then we get to move rapidly through the agenda.
All right.
On to financial update. Well,
okay. So this is a little bit of administrivia that we need to do, but it's still important. Is every year we're required to determine if we want to make adjustments to the retail delivery fee. We did this last year. So we said we've as staff, we've got a proposal, and we'll see how the board feels about it, and then we can move forward with it. So the retail delivery fee was originally set at 3 cents per delivery. The legislation that created the retail delivery fee allows for an adjustment on an annual basis, and that's based on inflation. So we basically get information from Department of Revenue on what the inflation rate was last year, and then based on that, put together a recommendation to the board for approval, and then that gets communicated to the Department of Revenue. We need to do that by March 15th, so that's why it's on the agenda today. Next slide, please. So I'm sure you all know this, but the retail delivery fee is there's a bunch of different accounts within it. We have one that's the Clean Transit retail delivery fee, and said our portion of it was originally 0.3 cents, and that's gone up to 0.3222 cents or 3.222 cents over the last 2 years. And that gets rolled together into an overall fee. And it's important to recognize that the overall fee can only move in increments of a cent. So they're sort of rolling together the increases from all the agencies to get to what's an overall increase in the fee. Our recommendation, based on the inflation rate from 2024, we make a recommendation for what happens in calendar year 2025. And essentially, it's the inflation rate. If you go to the next slide, please. The inflation rate that the Department of Revenue used was 2.27. The inflation rate for fees was 4.76. And that basically equates to, for our fee, raising it another 1/10 of a cent to 0.033, or I guess that's 3.33 cents per delivery. Let me go ahead on to the last slide. So as I said, that's essentially our ability is to set the rate, to increase it or not if you don't want to. As the staff recommendation is that we go ahead and make a motion to increase the fee. And as I said, if Chairman Jones, I guess I'll leave that to you if you want to push for a motion or if we need to have other discussion.
Sure. Are there any questions before we possibly entertain a motion? Hearing no questions, is there anyone that would like to make the proposed motion?
This is Board Member Brackey. I move to approve the motion.
I
Would-
second.
So for the record keeping, would you prefer for us to state the language as written?
I guess we should for the recording. So yeah, you want me to do it or are you going to do it?
Oh, I can do it. Oh, sorry, I was just trying to be quick. So, I move to approve the proposed motion for the Clean Transit Enterprise to adopt a new retail delivery fee level of 3/100 and 33 10,000 cents for FY 2026 based on the recommendation from the Department of Revenue and Enterprise staff.
And I believe we had a second.
All right. Thank you, Director Brackey. All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, motion passes.
Okay, thank you very much. So the next steps is I'll communicate that to the Department of Revenue, and they'll integrate it into the broader fee, and then that will be adjusted starting July 1, the beginning of the state fiscal year 2026. So thank you much. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I think we have the financial update, and then I'll be running us through a budget approval. Kay, I don't know if you start off here. Let's go ahead to the next slide.
Sure. Hello, I'm Kay Hareska. I'm the Enterprise Controller, and this is the budget to actual for CTE for Fund 540. As you see, we've collected $6.3 million in retail delivery fee and approximately $397,000 in interest. Most of our expenses so far have been related to staff salaries and attorney general fees. I will now turn it over to Sam and Cassie. Next slide, please.
Hi, everyone. Sam Foster, Office of Financial Management and Budget. And I've got our two usual revenue and cash fund balance slides. On the left, we've got our revenue forecasts. Those haven't changed from the past couple of meetings. The one update in the chart is from the month of January, the fees collected, and we see the holiday bump kind of up to 1.2 million, just under. And we'll go to the second slide. And for the cash balance, year ending was 19.4 million, and then as of February 13th, currently 26.2 million, and that's well over the spending authority adopted by the JBC last year of 18.1. And I'll pass over to Cassie for the legislative update.
All right. You go to the next slide for me. Thank you. I'm Cassie Rudder. I'm in the Office of Financial Management and Budget. Wanted to provide an update on the legislative budget request. So as a reminder, back in November, we submitted a decision item on behalf of the board that was requesting the Joint Budget Committee to sponsor legislation that would continuously appropriate the Clean Transit Enterprise Cash Fund. Obviously, that would have multiple benefits if they would have approved that. Unfortunately, on February 6th, we had our department figure setting, and the JBC did actually deny the request for continuous spending authority. So they did not want to do that. Basically, they just did not want to give up control. As you know, right now, the cash fund is annually appropriated by the legislature, which means that they can set the spending authority. That's basically saying how much the enterprise is allowed to actually encumber and spend out of the cash fund in a given fiscal year. So they are currently able to set that threshold each year. They want to retain that ability, that authority. So they did deny the request, but they did grant approval for us to have 3 years of roll forward authority going forward, and that would start with the fiscal year 26 appropriation. So we do have one small issue with that, though. Right now, the amount of spending they did approve for fiscal year 26, we requested based on the amount of retail delivery fee revenue that is being forecasted for fiscal year 26. So that spending authority would allow us to go ahead and award and encumber that new revenue that we collect, but it doesn't give us access to the revenue that was collected in previous fiscal years, which in many cases has already been committed and awarded out to grants. So we do need them to increase the spending authority so that we can cover any commitments and awards that were made using prior year revenue. So we are going to work with the governor's office and probably submit what's it's called a comeback, where we ask the joint budget committee to reconsider their action. If the board wants, that comeback can you please reconsider and approve that continuous spending authority as we requested. We don't recommend that. I don't think they're going to go for that. They're not likely to approve that, but if the board wanted to, that could be the request that we go back with. The alternative option would be for us to ask them to go ahead and increase the spending authority to an amount that aligns more closely with the actual fund balance in the Clean Transit Enterprise Cash Fund. And that way, the board, you would have access to the full balance of the fund. You can cover any commitments from prior years and then award new grants using any new revenue as well. So that would be our recommendation, but of course it's up to you. And we just wanted to provide that update so that you kind of know where things are at. Any questions? All right, then I will turn it back on over to Craig.
Cassie, actually, I was going to ask a question, and
Sure.
I guess if the JVC or the JVC doesn't respond to that, what you call it, the callback, what sort of happens then?
Yeah, so if we do a comeback and ask them to increase the spending authority, that's more in line with the fund balance. And if they say no and deny that, then the spending authority for fiscal year 26 would be limited to the 12.9 million that they would be putting into the long bill for fiscal year 26. So that would be the legal budget, and we would not be able to exceed that. So what that would mean is, in our financial system, we could not have more budget than that 12.9 million. So we couldn't have any more encumbered or committed or spend more than that. So it would definitely have a pretty big impact. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Chairman Jones or any other board members, any questions or comments about the budget status? I guess while we're on legislative update, I thought I should also say is we had some back and forth coming up to the board meeting related to the SB 230 funds as to whether the impacts of Prop 117 kicked in or finished at the end of fiscal year 2025 and 26. And so the AG's office and OSPB were going back and forth, and they ended up deciding that it really does impact the fund until FY26. So we're still going to be affected by the $100 million cap for 5 years through 2026. For a while, we thought we were going to have a bunch more money in FY26. And actually, we had to delay getting out the board packet until we resolved the issue. But that's another thing that's kind of going on there on the sort of the legislative or broad budget front. Okay, why don't we, next slide. So the next few slides relate to our budget. And I guess before I became director at CTE, we had at the October board meeting, Kay Kelly presented a draft FY26 budget that the board approved, but now we need to finalize that, which will then get sent to the Transportation Commission and rolled up into CDOT's broader budget. The budget that we presented back in October was actually rolled up with all the different funds, but because the different accounts that were within the CTE, we actually need to get approval of the individual cash funds. So I've got a few things that I got to run through. I thought I'd go through all of them and then we can have a discussion. And then if it's okay, we'll move forward with a motion. So first of all, the current slide that's up there, this is Cash Fund 515. This is the portion of the oil and gas production fee that goes to the formula program. So this is 70% of the oil and gas fees. And you see the amount is just under $39 million. Again, this is being affected by the Prop 117 cap, which limits, I think, the overall funding for oil and gas to something around $55 million. It will be a little bit of a relationship between that and what happens with retail delivery fee, but this is a pretty solid estimate. So the overall amount of revenues we expect to get is just under $39 million. A portion of that is the administrative and operating costs. We've allocated 70% of the administrative and operating costs to the oil and gas fund portion of the CTE, and then 30% to the retail delivery fee portion. And then within that 70% that's allocated towards the oil and gas production fee, we've prorated them across the different programs. So again, for the formula program, the overall number is 39 million. After the about a $500,000 in administrative costs, that leaves like 38,370,000 that we can actually program out and allocate. Let me go on to the next couple slides, and then we can stop and talk about it. The second fee, the second account, this is the discretionary program, or 10% of the oil and gas fees. That equates to just a little over $5.5 million. So we allocate $73,655,000 of administrative costs to that. So that leaves just under 5.5 that'd be available for discretionary grants under the oil and gas program. Go over to the third one. Okay, and this is the third part of this is the 20% that goes to passenger rail. Again, it's just a little over 11 million. We allocate a little under $150,000 in administrative costs, and we end up with just something a little below 11 million in program funds. So those three slides represent our proposed FY26 budgets for the oil and gas fees. Let me go on to the other funds now. All right, this is the retail delivery fee. It's a little bit what Cassie was just talking about. But like I said, we anticipate getting just under $13 million in revenues. We've got about 315,663 in administrative costs, and that leaves us with 11,292,000 available for programs. So that's really all of the grant program budgets. And then the other budget that we have to talk about is the actual loan that we received that was approved in October, or the board approved in October. This is the what we call Fund 540, or 541. I'm sorry, can you go to the next slide? Yeah, okay. So this is a $600,000 loan. Because of the timing of when this was approved, so it was approved in October, the Transportation Commission granted it, and it got set up at the end of calendar year 24. So we don't actually have an approved FY year 25 budget for this. So this is the proposed FY25 budget, and this is covering things like our salary and our AG costs and our consulting professional services. So we're looking at a budget of roughly $200,000 out of the loan for FY25, and then we're going to use that through FY26. And if you go to the next slide, yeah, there we go. It said we'll have about $377,000 going into FY26, and the plan is to spend that down through the end of FY26, and then we'll be able to use the revenues that are actually flowing from the oil and gas fee to both pay off that loan and to continue the CTE's operations. So sorry, that was a bunch of information, and some of this I realize you haven't seen, but let me pause there and see if any of the board members have any questions or concerns about the budgets I've presented.
Hey, Craig, this is David. Just one question. Seems like this money comes back in, it comes into the system through Department of Revenue, correct? Do I have that right?
Yeah.
I'm not seeing any fees from Department of Revenue, and I see them on my sales tax and lodging tax that they collect on our behalf. I'm just curious how that's handled at the state.
Good question. I don't actually have the answer to it.
Okay.
I'm wondering if Kathy or Kay, if you know the answer to that, or Sam.
This is Cassie. So I'm pretty sure the way that works, statute allows for DOR to retain as much revenue as they require to cover their costs, to administer collection of the revenue, and then the rest is remitted to us, to our
Okay.
Fund 400. So they kind of just keep off the top whatever it requires to administer.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yep.
Any other board questions or comments? Okay, Chairman Jones, so I do need, we're requesting that the board do a formal motion to approve the budgets. So I'll kind of leave it to you to orchestrate that.
All right. Thank you so much for the presentation.
I believe we can just do one motion to approve all of the budgets, but we don't have to go one through one. So
Thanks. So do I hear a motion from the directors to approve the CTE's fiscal year 2026 budget?
I'll make that motion to approve the fiscal year 26 budget for CTE.
Also, actually, sorry, if we could amend it to say it's a combination of the additional FY26 and FY26 budgets.
Can I take that as a friendly amendment?
Yeah.
Okay, then we'll do that. Thank you.
Do I hear a second?
I second.
All right, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Hi.
Any opposed? Hearing none, motion passes.
Okay, next slide. Okay, well, that was sort of the boring administrative part of our board meeting. Thank you for all weathering through that. And it's sort of my first time trying to negotiate all the budget stuff. So if I bumbled through it all, my apologies. But so now we're going to get to something more interesting, which is really talking about, the first step in SB 230 implementation and really the formula grant program under SB 230. So my hope for today is I'm not looking to get approval or get a formal decision from the board. What I want to do is talk about some of the eligibility considerations, get the board's thoughts and ideas about it. And then based on that input, we're going to go back, work on coming up with a draft sort of policy and process for determining eligibility or stating who's eligible and who's not. And we'll bring that to the board meeting in March. And then I guess depending on how that goes, either the board can approve it or we can have discussion, decide that there's some changes are needed, then we can come back in April and see if we can get to a completion then. But I've tried to lay out what I think are some of the key things we ought to think about when we're talking about eligibility, and sort of see what you think. I'd also note that some of the parts of this process blend together. So we're talking about some things related to what agencies are at least initially eligible to participate in the program. And then from that we'll go through a process where then we actually get information from the agencies and determine that you're really going to be able to participate. And even so there'll be some crossover in these topics as we talk about eligibility and then being qualified, and even some of the eligibility questions may influence what we want to talk about in terms of the formula as well. So I don't feel too constrained that if you feel like something ought to be a formula consideration rather than eligibility. Until we really sort that out, there's going to be some sort of blurring of lines in this area. Anyhow, I've laid out sort of 4 areas that I want us to talk about. The first is, I think, the broadest question of just, what types of agencies or what type of service do we feel should be eligible for the formula program and what shouldn't. Secondly, I think it's important that we talk about expectations for local match. Is there a local match requirement and what should it be? Third, there's a requirement in the statute that participating agencies submit a system optimization plan or system improvement plan. I know there's a kind of there's a little vague terms or a little undefined, but it's what the legislature gave us. So I think don't get too wrapped around what the name of that is. But I do think it's important that we talk about what we think needs to go into those plans and what requirements we want to create for them. And then there's a bunch of other eligibility considerations. So let me jump into the first slide here. Sorry, do you want to go? There you go. So this is my sort of own categorization, but I broke the agencies, transit agencies around the state into 3 categories. And on one side, you've got, I think what we think of as probably traditional transit agencies that are providing both fixed route and open door service. On the other side, we've got closed door service where they tend to be more client driven. Their specific populations are eligible to ride, but it's not, it's not an open door where anyone can just hop on a bus or a van and use it. So they're more restricted. And in between that are these open door, I call open door demand response providers where anyone can use them, but they're not providing fixed route services. Everything is on demand. And that's I think, what you see a lot of the rural communities. The actual numbers around the state associated with these sometimes it's hard to fit the agencies in a specific box, but based on a count I've done, I think there's roughly 25 closed door only providers. There's about 16 just open door demand response providers, and then about 39 or 40 fixed route providers also provide on-demand service. So I think a key question for the board is, and I guess to put it bluntly, sort of who's it? Do we want to just make some definitions about which types of service should be eligible for the funding or not? And going through it on including closed door providers, they do a lot for mobility and accessibility, particularly in rural areas. A lot of those agencies struggle to get adequate funding. On the other hand, they're not really considered public transit since they're not open door. I've done some research about the impacts of on-demand service, particularly closed door on-demand service, and they tend to add VMT rather than decrease it, which I think kind of butts up against our greenhouse gas reduction rules. They might play a little bit, but it's a limited role in helping with multimodal connectivity, since they tend to be sort of connecting just specific locations. I also concern about do we kind of open up a bit of a rat's nest where suddenly anyone who's operating a car or van can claim that they're eligible for the program, and suddenly we're spreading the money very thin. On the open door side, again, they're very important in the rural areas because they're open door. They fit the definition of public transit. And as I said, they do play a role in supporting multimodal and statewide connectivity. On the sort of limitations, again, because they're on demand, their impact on reducing VMT is not as strong as fixed route. It adds a bunch of agencies, so we're spreading the money a little more thinly. And, again, they tend to be small agencies. So if we're really looking to get big increases in ridership, I'm not sure how big the impact is. And then the fixed door providers, again, I think are pretty clearly, what we think of as public transit. They provide, I think, the strongest benefits in terms of connectivity, multimodal and statewide connectivity. They're great for mobility accessibility. And that's where I think we're really getting an impact on load shift and reduction. The other thing is particularly as you get into bigger agencies, it might be a little more challenging to isolate their impacts. Anyhow, talked a lot. would really love to just hear the board's thoughts on, what do they think about these categories and who, should be eligible or shouldn't be eligible for the formula funding.
Any director feedback for Craig?
And we actually are pretty far ahead on our schedule. So yeah, take as much time as you want to talk about it.
I see Don's hand. Director Block.
So as one of those smaller rural agencies and part of a region that has probably 12 of those same smaller agencies, I would encourage the enterprise to keep an open mind on the demand response. A lot of us, that's the only thing we provide is demand response, just because of our limited space down here. We're about the only game in town. So we have several here in the southeast corner of the state that do provide both fixed route and demand. But most of our stuff comes from demand response. I have a pretty strong feeling about closed door providers. I don't think they meet the definition of public transit, and they may be an, oh, by the way, we might consider it if we have extra. But I would not put them on a first review. I would rather see them as maybe an other category and not compete against these others.
Great, thank you. Director Brecky.
Great, thank you. I have similar thoughts. I agree that it's important for the open door demand response to be eligible, given the types of services that are provided in different communities across the state, obviously along with the fixed route. I do have concerns about including the closed door because that service is not open to the public. So I guess I'm leaning toward the 2 out of 3 being eligible for the list. But I'm curious what other board members think as well.
Thank you. Director Coffin.
Thanks, and sorry I didn't raise my hand before when I spoke. I guess a question I have is, and maybe this is for someone at CDOT, if closed door doesn't meet the definition of public transit, are they even eligible under our regulatory authority?
I think so. I mean, the legislation is pretty vague when it talks about who's eligible. And secondly, it's there's some gray in there when you talk about the closed door providers in terms of the requirements they make to be able to use the service. So some of them seem sort of open door-ish, but like you don't necessarily have to be in a certain category, but you have to register for them. So part of, I think, my job, or CTE's job, would be to come back and come up with some tighter definition of what, really constitute as closed door versus open door on demand. But I'm not sure, I put in there that definition of public transit, but, there's sort of definitions of public transit all over the place that it's not always easy to find like just, one single answer to the question. So the point is, I think we have to put some definition to ourselves, but I'm kind of curious if others have thoughts about it, but I'm not sure, based on what's in SB 230, that we could just say, outright, like, no, the law doesn't, the statute doesn't intend it or precludes it. I would say that talking to the governor's office, they made pretty clear that, the intention of the law was not really to have that funding going to the closed door providers.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful.
Thanks. Now, Director Frommer.
Yeah, thanks for breaking it down this way. For me, I'm just thinking back to the legislation. So Senate Bill 230, this is the creation of an oil and gas production fee through our enterprise. And a purpose of which is to use the revenue collected from oil and gas production to offset the negative impacts created by oil and gas production by reducing the pollution. And so just when I'm thinking about or looking at the limitations for some of these categories, those that don't reduce VMT and therefore emissions would be a lower priority for me than the bottom category, where we are replacing vehicle trips with transit, ideally electric transit, and therefore offsetting the negative impacts of oil and gas production. So I would lean toward like a focus on that third row.
I think another important consideration is that, you know, there's sort of, we have multiple bites of this apple in terms of, you know, we can say, okay, here's overall eligibility, but then we can also look at the formula to decide what we want to prioritize. And we don't have to necessarily have everyone just in one pool. We could do some sub allocations, say, you know, for just the open door providers, you know, to see how much money we want to have go to them as opposed to the, you know, more the fixed route. So, you know, there are some things that we can do down the road as well if, you know, if we decide to keep them in here.
Director Coffin?
Yeah, thanks. And yeah, I tend to agree with Director Frommer, but also with what Craig just said. So perhaps maybe the third row, and maybe this is stuff we could work out in a future meeting. We could prioritize that third row, or maybe even come up with some program where the third row might receive a higher percentage of funding than other providers or agencies.
Thank you. Director Brackey?
I think Kelly was before me in the queue.
Oh, I'm not seeing another hand.
Director Williams has her hand up.
All right, I'll jump in. Just was going to say, I think I tend to agree with Director Frommer, and just was looking back at the legislation, and there's certainly a lot of emphasis on increasing frequent, convenient, reliable transit and ridership and lowering greenhouse gas emissions. And so I do think whether it's, you know, wholly focusing our attention there or to Craig's point of prioritizing in some way, it does seem like the new business purpose really does direct our focus in that direction.
All right, now over to Director Brackey.
Great, thank you. And so it's helpful to hear the different perspectives on, I guess the question I have is when I see the title of this, it's transit agency / service type, and many agencies provide both types of service. So you have agencies that are providing fixed route as well as on-demand and routes and or services, and they're designed to be complementary. So is this around eligibility of the entity to participate in the process? Or is it around eligibility of that? Are we getting down to the service level, service specificity? So I guess that's a sorting question that I have around how do we handle entities that do multiple types of service provision?
Great question. So yeah, I mean, for agencies that have fixed route, you know, are receiving FTA funds, I believe they're required to actually provide on demand as well. So you know, all those agencies are going to be providing both. So, you know, again, I tried to kind of isolate it. Well, agencies that aren't doing fixed route and just doing on demand, it seemed like an important distinction. But in your comment is sort of a broader point is about there's sort of eligibility in terms of agencies and who's in and who's out, you know, to be in the formula. But I think there's also a question about eligible activities that you can get reimbursed for. And, you know, I think an important consideration for the board is if we decide that closed door providers are out, or even if you decide that these, open door demand, on demand only providers are not eligible, then, it doesn't seem like it would be fair for the fixed route demand agencies at a fixed rate to then be able to get money for doing open door or closed door service. So I think what we decide here will actually have an impact on what actual activities or costs can get reimbursed as part of the program. But I guess it is important to recognize that what we're doing here may also impact how we actually administer the grants and what we enable to be reimbursable and what is not.
Okay, thank you for kind of considering those two aspects of this. So that's helpful for me. I guess I still think about the open door or demand response only line, thinking about the application of transit across the state. Some of us have a lot of familiarity with the Front Range more urban condition, but how are we, and again, maybe this comes out more in the formula side of things, but recognizing, yes, there's the goals around ridership and VMT reduction, but it's also around how to grow transit as an option for more people in more places. So how could we handle that, whether it's through an eligibility side or maybe it's more in the formula and process. So that I tend to think about these things as a Rubik's Cube, the three-dimensional approach to it. So it's complicated, but trying to figure out how are we setting up the program to allow for eligibility in a way that meets the diverse types of needs across the state.
I'm not seeing any more hands. Maybe just to quickly summarize, and I'm seeing Director Coffin, but real quick, what I'm hearing so far, Craig, is nobody's expressed any interest in trying to leave an option available for closed door service or agencies, but certainly open door agencies, both for demand response and for, of course, fixed route. But maybe leaning more on, and Director Brekke summarized what I had in my brain, leaning on how we measure the effectiveness of what's being proposed to determine funding eligibility, not necessarily restricting it just to fixed route. Director Coffin?
Thank you, Chair Jones. And just for my clarification, just so I'm not missing anything, can you maybe, Craig, clarify how those top two rows would often increase VMT?
Yeah, I guess it really gets down to induced demand. That if people are, if it's on demand, if there's only one person in the vehicle and that vehicle wouldn't be running if the service wasn't available, arguably that's induced demand. That's my sort of lay version of what would happen. But I think the key thing is if you're creating trips but you're not creating mode shift, that those are new chips that wouldn't otherwise have, presumably that's VMT. And that's based on the small amount of research I did. That's kind of what they said about it.
Director Averill.
I'll chime in. I think you guys know where I'm at based on previous conversations with the board around eligibility for the electrification program. So I would prefer that closed door only folks just aren't eligible unless down the road we're not spending the program funds and we feel like we want to bring them in at that point. But I wouldn't want to bring them in right off the bat. With regard to the question about open door demand response, just to kind of echo what Dawn said earlier, just what I've seen out here in the Western Slope, it may be that these agencies are doing open door demand response only, but at the same time, they often will do, like, I'll just use the town of Nucla Natarita as an example. They used to have 2 or 3 days of medical trips out there, sort of on demand, in that you had to get a reservation. You had to let them know you were gonna need the ride, where you're gonna go. They were going to Junction, but they would have a van of like half a dozen people. It wasn't just a 1-person ride. So I think that's really super down in the weeds. I totally admit that, but like these agencies that are serving these very sparse parts of the state with quite vast differences between basic services like medical, things like that. They are actually, I think, combining rides and in some ways saving VMT. They're saving an uncle or a nephew or a niece from having to drive their aunt or grandma to the hospital or to the dialysis center or something like that. So I'd be a little bit careful about that in certain pockets of the state. Again, particularly these quite vast, low population areas. It's a lifeline to essential services in many ways. And they are public agencies. They are open to the public. And I'd hate to see them frozen out completely just by the nature of their service types. But I would agree with what I'm hearing the rest of the board say that may not be the priority. But I would fight to keep them in for eligibility myself. That's just my take on it.
One consideration, or maybe two considerations. One is that some of those on-demand, those closed-door providers, we believe are eligible for some of the FDA 5310 funding. And I guess I'll say staff corrects me, but I think that's the case. So there is some funding available. Secondly, within the broader oil and gas production fee program, we've got a discretionary program, with 10% of the funds. Those are going to be, could be more one-off grants. But, if we feel like there's someone who's really getting, left out, and that it's important and critical, we could address it through the discretionary program as well. It would give us a little bit more control over who gets it. And again, might be more sort of one-off or a year or two to get something going. But keep in mind that there are some other options we could put on the table if we really feel like something's getting missed, a critical need's getting missed.
Director Brackey.
Thank you. I just wanted to respond and going to echo some of David Abrils' comments about, again, the different context around the state. But I also wanted to give an example of demand responsive service that is actually increasing the use of interregional transit. And so not to get more in the weeds, but just to give examples so that we're not painting everything with the same brush. So for example, the city of Longmont offers a on-demand service called Ride Longmont. That is the only way for people to get to the Bustang stop at I-25 and 119, the new mobility hub that CDOT built there, which is fantastic. But currently that stretch of 119 between Longmont into I-25 is outside of the RTD district. So in order for people from Longmont to connect to the Bustang service, they really need to rely on that on-demand service. So it's not just, I understand the localized situation where it could generate more VMT versus reducing it, but in the case of providing access to regional transit and increasing the use of regional transit, I think it actually has a multiplier effect in terms of reducing VMT. So I just want to be thinking about these things as broadly as possible and the different types of services that are necessary in our different contexts so that we can grow ridership for transit at all levels, including regional, interregional service. So just another 2 cents to throw in the mix.
One thing, Kathleen, as you're speaking, it just dawned on me that we got kind of complicated here in the last few years because historically in the business, we've always referred to, demand response as like, in my mind, I just automatically assume paratransit, medical trips for elderly or disabled. But now we also have microtransit. And that's on demand. And that's what you're talking about with that Longmont service. And so, I think to me, that's a little bit of a light bulb went off. Like, we don't want to freeze those folks out necessarily, I wouldn't think, because they do fill a good gap in a lot of these networks. That's a really interesting comment. Thanks for making that.
Great. Thank you.
Director Block.
I'm going to try not to get off into the weeds too much. I think we may want to change that demand response to microtransit, as they just suggested, because that's what we practice. But if you follow DOT definitions, we're defined as a demand response. So that may be something fixed as simple as changing the definition or changing the wording.
Director Liu.
Yeah, I think this is, a kind of fundamental threshold conversation for how the dollars are allocated. And I think one thing we're going to need to do before kind of moving forward is check with the AG and sort of how they're reading the intent in the legislation. My read in how it was worded and how the kind of GHG impact analysis rubrics were crafted was that it was more the achieving scale and volume was more important for this than for certain other sources of funds. So, I personally would have concerns that opening the door too wide and kind of having too broad a universe might actually run in conflict with some of the intent of the legislation, and would want to talk to the AG and others about it. Yeah, I also think that a challenge we've had with some of the sources of funding at CDOT is that once you get into the universe of there being, a very, very, very broad aperture of recipients, it both kind of undercuts the efficacy of the funds because they get spread very thin, but also makes the administrative burden very hard and has slowed down the process in some cases. So, I think we've seen, if I had to kind of point to something that has not worked as well with, MMOF and other sources, it's that there's so many recipients that, nobody's getting enough to make a difference that makes a difference in terms of magnitude, but secondarily, it just takes a long time to execute because, a contract for a small amount takes the same amount of overhead and time as a much larger one. So I think both of those feel to me like pretty serious considerations we need to sort of think through and resolve, both from kind of a intent framework, but also operationally.
All right. Before I make sure, Craig, you got everything you needed from this discussion, I just wanted to add on a little bit more, knowing, agencies across the country are reimagining how they're providing transit. I know that Atlanta just released I can't remember the name of it, but it's their system optimization plan where they have reduced fixed route services through circuitous suburban areas in favor of more predictable routing and microtransit options for those neighborhoods. So similar to the model that Director Brackey mentioned, making sure that folks still have access to get to the mainline transit without the expense of putting more empty, mostly empty vehicles at their end of line through residential areas. So thinking about how a grant might come through, a proposal could come through with a combination of fixed route plus microtransit that is operating more efficiently and helps a mainline transit route actually carry more passengers because it's no longer deviating off of its route into areas which detracts from possible ridership. But I think seems like we could learn more. Again, closed door seems from this discussion completely out. Some discussion still needed about the mix between fixed route and open door demand response or microtransit. Did you get everything you needed from us in this discussion?
I did, and thank you. It's an awkward topic sometimes a little bit, is that sort of who's in and out. But I think my job is to go and try and take that back and turn it into some sort of policy recommendation. So we've got about 20 minutes left, so I want to try and hit a couple more topics here before we wrap up, if I could. And I said, you'll get another bite of this apple. We're not, we'll come back with a draft policy on all these things. But let's go ahead on to the next slide. So I just want to talk briefly about the matching requirement. It's sort of an eligibility element because agencies are going to need to be able to provide, if we require a match, they're going to be able to need to provide to fund it in order to be eligible. I think there's a question if we have a match requirement, what's the right amount? Currently, all of CDOT's transit grant programs have a matching requirement. Generally, it's 20% for capital and 50% for operating. The benefits of it is it helps leverage the funding by presumably bringing local funding to the table into transit. It also improves accountability because the agencies have more skin in the game. I've talked to several transit agencies about the match. I really got no resistance to it. Everyone sort of said they thought it was fine. And, in some ways they actually like it because I think it helps them create some accountability and skin in the game for their own local boards. The issues with it's a little bit harder to administer. There are some smaller agencies where there might be a barrier, and there's some precedent here at CDOT to have either a sliding scale or you can do some type of waiver if you really wanted to. So there's some ways if that really is an issue that we could probably deal on more of a one-off basis. But I guess, again, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but how's the board feel about, having a match requirement? And is there a sense of maybe where, even if it's just like in the range wise or ballpark wise, what that match ought to be?
How much time do we have? Maybe, maybe if there's are there any directors that want to chime in and say that they think that there should be absolutely no match requirements as part of the disbursement of these funds? Any directors who want to speak to that desire?
I'll chime in a little bit on that. I feel like the Multimodal Options Fund operations program had a sliding match. I could be corrected on that if I'm wrong. And I don't know. I think there's one instance over here at the GVTPR where there was no match required for a service expansion. So there's sort of a precedent there. I'm not sure that I buy into it myself. And I could be mistaken, but I do believe that it's good to have some skin in the game at the agency level, but I think it would be interesting to entertain a conversation about the concept of a sliding match based on need. Because some of the small agencies, frankly, they won't be able to tap into the funding if the match is too high.
Director Coffin?
I would support that as well.
Thanks. So any additional, okay, I'm seeing some hands popping up and popping back down. So I'm not hearing anybody say absolutely no match. We could probably dive into for quite some time on whether we think there's a hard number, 20 or 50, but do folks agree that entertaining some sort of sliding scale? Do they agree with that feedback? I saw some nodding heads. Director Bracke?
Yeah, I just thought it would be better rather than nodding my head for the record to say that I do like that idea of having the sliding scale. I think that would be helpful to look into that approach. And then I guess the other piece that's related to that is for me anyway, how could that match requirement transition over time? And so maybe it's lower on the front end as an agency kind of ramps up, and then there's a plateau period where the match sits, and then maybe over time the match actually has to increase over time as the local agency takes on more and more of that ongoing responsibility. I know that's done in some other types of grant programs. So again, just a way to think about what the options might be.
Great, and I saw a thumbs up on those comments from Director Block and Director Averill.
Chairman Joe, I think moving forward, I feel like I got enough on this. I think we've got an agreement about a match. I can look at what's some of the precedent and really kind of leverage what's already sort of in place. On the whether it should be closer to 20% or the full 50%, that's let me work on something and come back with that next meeting, and we can kind of respond to that. The last thing I would say is I feel like with the sliding scale, it's a great idea, but I also think it shouldn't be automatic, that it's pretty much, here's the match, you got to request a waiver to it, so that we're pushing as many people not to be on the sliding scale as possible. But we're remaining flexible. If that's okay, I want to move on to the other slide. It's a kind of important one. Desiree, let's go to the next one. So, as I mentioned, the legislation requires an agency submit a system optimization plan. So it's important one is we've got a statutory requirement. And again, we might come up with a better name because I think it makes people awkward, or system improvement plan or something like that. But generally, I think it's also important because it shows that the agencies have the capacity and are ready to actually spend the funds and achieve the outcomes that we're looking for. But it also will provide the CTE the ability to kind of create accountability, to see what they're going to do, and then see are the funds really going to what you said it was going to do. And then the other consideration we don't really have to get into now is we might even want to look at what's in those system optimization plans as a consideration in our formula. Again, there isn't really a definition where you're like, oh, I know exactly what that is. So we need to define it a bit. And to me, at a basic level, saying, okay, what service expansions are you going to fund with this money? Are you going to increase routes? Are you going to increase frequency? Are you going to increase your service area? Things like that. Also, are you doing, either marketing promotions or service enhancements outside of expanding your passenger or your revenue hours or your platform miles? Are you doing things to just get more people into transit? I think what might be a little more challenging to ask is what impacts do the agencies have? They might be able to say what they're going to have in terms of revenue hours or something like that. But can we actually ask them project the increases in passenger in ridership? And then lastly, I think there's a couple other things in here, but what's important for us to consider is what time horizon are we going to ask for in this optimization plan? Presumably agencies are not going to be able, we're not going to be able to flick a switch on January 1 and give them the funding and their new routes are up and running. It'll take a while for procurement and planning and things like that. So it may be that some of the funding the first year is more focused on, say, promotions and enhancements, and then years 2 and 3 they're adding more routes or improve other service improvements. So what's a reasonable time horizon for these plans? So we've got about 10 minutes, 5 or 10 minutes for this. Let me kind of open that up just to kind of hear from the director board, what is it you think ought to go in these plans? Kind of curious also what you think a reasonable time horizon would be for them.
In 5 minutes or less.
Oh, we got 10. So.
All right. Any thoughts from directors on what should be included in these system optimization plans?
I'll chime in here. I think it's a 5-year horizon. Kind of typically, we've done down here at Smart. We've used a 5-year operating plan like cycle to refresh our expansion plans, capital plans that come along with that. It's all driven by service expansion. I think there probably ought to be, just on the accountability side of things, some performance metrics that may be agency specific, and they may be uniform across the entire state, that we all need to report kind of the same things. And we often do that already with our NTD reporting, our National Transit Database reporting. So that's one thing I would caution against, any kind of reporting requirements. As an operator, I'd really appreciate it if it wasn't duplicative with what we're already giving CDOT. That just make more work for us. I think, a reasonable financial forecast should be a part of this, so that if you're saying you're going to expand services, that you can, reasonably forecast a budget that shows you're going to be able to support those services and the capital assets that go along with them. And then, if you get to a tipping point in the agency and you trigger like a maintenance facility expansion project or something like that, you probably ought to give that a nod too, because those, as much as those things aren't exciting as new service and cutting ribbons for new parking rides and things like that, the maintenance side of the house, the capital facilities side of the house is just as important to support all the growth in services. So, to me, it's kind of an agency gut check every few years. Operations primarily drive everything you do, but you have to consider the capital needs that go along with that if you're going to grow things. And that's been something that we really struggled with down here the first few years. A lot of pressure to grow and not a lot of capital resources to back it up. You don't want to end up in that position. But that's my quick take on it in less than 5 minutes, Chris.
Maybe I should have given a more accurate budget. 30 seconds per director. 5 minutes. Okay. Director Bracke.
We're doing great.
I think Don was before me.
Sorry.
Sorry, it's hard with the hands because they don't come with the number like the other formats do.
and the camera, I look at the camera hands and not the list hands. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's.
So mine's going to be pretty short and sweet. Yeah, what David said. I would support that. I think that just also shows that they've done a little bit of homework and they have a plan as to where they're going, and you're not just throwing money willy-nilly at something that nobody's really put a lot of thought into.
Now, Director Bracke. There you go.
Sorry, should I go now? Okay. Oh, yeah. So I guess one of the questions I have, and it's related to what, what we call this, and I understand it has to be called the SOP because of what's in the legislation, but I think defining it as if agencies have a transit plan and they may have their own version of this, it has its own name. So what are the things that qualify as a SOP? I think that would be helpful. And then I guess one of the challenges I think about is how do we accelerate the pace of change and to start getting more things in place more quickly? And so, yes, we have a tendency to focus on, how long it takes to get these things stood up and then run them. So I'm just wondering, within that time horizon, are there milestones that help incentivize like early action items or things that can get rolled out sooner rather than later? Because I think there is a pent-up hunger for transit in a lot of different ways. And if there's something we can do through this resource to start accelerating that pace of change, I think that would be helpful. Again, I don't want to be naive in what it takes. I understand what it takes to set up new routes and new service, but are there ways inside the time horizon to accelerate implementation? And I'm not sure what we want to call that, but it's just a suggestion.
Thank you. One thought I just have is, from a practical implementation point of view, like I appreciate that agencies have plans, but say if RTD gives me like their SOP or whatever the equivalent, I'm still not going to have any idea what they're spending SB 230 money on versus other stuff. So, again, we don't want to make extra work. On the other hand, I think we will need agencies to be able to isolate, here's what I'm doing with the CTE funding versus other things. So, I think that in a lot of ways, I think they just extract things. If they have existing plans, they extract it from it and give us that and say, okay, here's what's our plan is for the SB 230 money.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I didn't mean to say that they would just, an existing plan would count per se, just, so I really appreciate that clarification. We want that specificity around, what are those programs, projects or services that we're going to be using the CTE funding, and how does that work? So thank you for clarifying that.
Dr. Coffin.
Yeah, so I think it will be important to have the agencies include discussion on greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And I just want to point out that in Senate Bill 230, under the system optimization plan section, it does say that the plan should describe how it will meet other purposes from another subsection, which specifically calls out decreasing VMT, greenhouse gas emissions, and other air pollutants. So I think what's in that right-hand column of the slide, can already fit into that, but I think we should maybe clearly state that as a requirement to be included in the plan. I don't know, there's a bunch of stuff that I think could be useful and interesting, but I'm also sensitive to Director Abrils' comment about not wanting to be duplicative, and also wanting to make sure that if we require information in these plans that, making sure that it's going to be used towards something. But I mean, I think it can be useful to have them include information about their fleet and if they could support electric buses, particularly like on a one-to-one basis, or if depending on the route, if they wouldn't be able to replace it one-to-one, looking at infrastructure as well, maybe ridership trends, looking at like areas with high transit propensity and low ridership, so like opportunity areas. I guess the other thing that maybe I'd like for feedback from others is any thoughts on if these plans should include public input or not, like whether that's even just in the form of surveys. I'm curious about that, but I'll stop there.
I'll just real quick, just to make sure we're hearing from anybody that has not spoken yet, just because we're running out of time. Want to make sure Craig's getting the feedback he needs. I know I probably get a little bit more time with him than the rest of you, so I might talk with him outside of this meeting. But you know, I really appreciate everything that everybody's said, and especially that last comment. You know, if we are able to leverage this money to get some agencies, I won't name the one that I'm thinking of, to actually communicate with their customers and involve them effectively in the decision-making process, as opposed to a black box planning approach where agency knows best and delivers media or service everywhere. Again, not going to mention who I'm thinking of, but just want to understand how we can, yes, not be redundant or create more work for folks who are trying to do the right thing and serve as many people as possible, as effectively as possible, and meet all these great goals that we have, but also use this as an opportunity to leverage folks to do better.
Thanks. Like I said, you know, I'll encourage, you know, all the directors, if you have additional thoughts that didn't come up, you know, we didn't get time to talk about today, you know, please reach out to me. Director Coffin, I'd like to talk to you maybe offline a little bit about just, you know, how we would bring greenhouse gas, you know, reduction projections or things like that into this process while making it something that's practical. You know, we can require it, but are we just going to get garbage in, garbage out kind of thing? Let me go to the last slide here. Again, we might just ask you guys to weigh in on some of these things by just emailing me directly. But Desiree, if you could go to the next slide. Okay, so just these are a few other things that I thought about that we could potentially consider in eligibility. They could also be things that get that influence the formula. But one is just, you know, past agency. I don't know that we've got any agencies that are really, you know, have given money back, but haven't done a great job of implementing past grants. But, you know, we could look at that as a consideration that, you know, if someone has given money back twice, why are we giving them more formula money? You know, just looking at what agencies have done in terms of the local funding, if they, you know, have dropped their local funding for transit in the last 2 or 3 years, you know, do we want to be giving them formula money? It could go either way on that. I also think this is something we might want to really consider going forward, though, in terms of making sure that agencies are maintaining at least the current level of funding efforts and not, you know, just using the swapping out SB 230 money for local money and then moving that money somewhere else. We talked a little bit about performance metrics in an optimization plan, but, you know, is there any type of performance indicators we'd like to address in consideration? You know, another thing is just what are the planning activities of the agencies? Are there certain things that we would like agencies to do to be eligible, like participating in the Transit Asset Management Initiative? We talked about having EV plans. This is also something that might be a little, you know, doing it now when people didn't know there was, you know, money at stake for participating feels a little after the fact, but it's something we might want to go think about going forward. And then just another idea that I don't know if it's a good one I threw out is, you know, do we, and again, this might be something more, it's a formula consideration, but do we want to look at where agencies are in terms of getting back to pre-COVID ridership levels? And, you know, require them to ever be over some threshold, you know, or to make that a consideration formula. So we only got about 1 minute, so I probably ought to just sort of ask board members to go ahead and, you know, either contact me directly or email me. Please just send it to me so we're not, again, violating some sunshine laws. But I think I probably will need to take input and then process that into a broader formula. Or a broader policy recommendation. With that, we're right at the end of the time. Could we go to our next step slide here? One more, please. So just in terms of what's the next meeting, again, we're now, I think, are scheduled where we're doing this the final Tuesday of every month from 2 to 3:30, or if we maybe should schedule a little more time. One, we said we're going to bring back the results from the round 2 EV planning grants and the recommendations for which projects should get funded. I hope to have conducted some engagement and we'll have some preliminary results to talk about what we're hearing from the transit agencies. Like I said, I'm gonna try and take all the input that I got today and anything that you provide me and draft a sort of eligibility policy recommendation for the board to chew on, and we'll see how far we get with that. And then I think it's time we start talking about the apportionment formula. Hopefully I'll have my decision science consultant on board, and we can kind of, I think if nothing else, just start talking about what do we think about the factors that were in the legislation and how to translate those into apportionment considerations. And also, are there other things that we want to consider? And then I think by then I actually should be able to have a broader, kind of refined view about our overall implementation schedule. So that's kind of what's coming. Again, I appreciate the dialogue today. I know, we kind of rolled up our sleeves for the first time and we're really kind of mucking around in the policy. And I thought there's great input from the board. I really appreciate everyone's thoughts and considerations on it. So with that, I'll turn it over back to you, Chairman Jones.
Thank you so much, Craig, and thank you to the rest of the directors. With that, I am happy to adjourn the meeting.
Thank you all.
Thank you.